Montana Territory, spring of 1877. The wind carried dust and judgment as freely as it carried the scent of blooming sagebrush. Willara Mae McCrae stood on the porch of her uncle's feed store in the town of Giltwater, laughing too loud for a woman in a place like this. Her laugh rang like a cracked bell, too bold for the quiet men and whispering wives that passed her by. She knew the looks they gave her. She had known them since she was 12 and her mother died, leaving behind a girl who spoke too much, laughed too freely, and never once learned how to keep her voice soft. "She sounds like a pack of coyotes," Mrs. Cornwell muttered as she passed with her basket. Willara just smiled wide and tossed a wink toward the bakery window where a boy of about 6 stood, nose pressed to the glass. He grinned back. "Better coyotes than sheep," she said under her breath, brushing her palms on her skirts and heading inside to fetch the shipment ledger. She had been helping her uncle since last fall, when her father drank himself into his grave and left her with nothing but her mother's wedding ring and a busted-down wagon with one wheel missing. It was her uncle's kindness that brought her here, but even he said she was too much, too loud, too opinionated, too everything. "Too loud to marry," he said last week, not cruel but tired. "You scare the men off, Willa." She had said nothing then, only smiled that same too big smile and gone back to invoicing oats. The cowboy rode into town 2 days later, just as the sun dipped low and the dust turned gold. He was tall, lean, sunburnt in that way of men who spend more time in the saddle than under a roof. His hat was bent at the brim, one side curled from years of habit. He wore a duster the color of creek clay and rode a chestnut with a scar along its left flank. He dismounted slowly, like a man who had fought off more than just bandits and weather. "Daryn Tate." He asked for feed, a dry place to rest, and if anyone could help him fix a cracked wheel on his wagon. "I can," Willara said from the back of the store, stepping forward with a coil of wire and a hammer already in hand. He looked at her, really looked, and smiled slow. "You always fix things that fast, miss?" "Only when they need fixing," she said, setting the hammer on the counter. "Wheel's not the only thing looks busted," he chuckled low and warm. "Neither is the man driving it." They worked in the alley behind the store until the moon came up. She talked. He listened. She asked questions. He answered careful like a man not used to sharing. "I got a place out east, near Powder River. House is empty now. Ma passed last winter. Brothers scattered. Just me and the land." "You do not sound like you mind the quiet, Mr. Tate." "I do not." He looked at her then, eyes steady. "But a house can get too quiet, too hollow." She laughed, louder than she meant to. "Well, I am rarely called quiet." "I figured," he said, and his eyes crinkled at the corners. By the end of the week, he had stayed longer than he meant to. He helped unload grain sacks, chased off a drunk who tried to corner Willara behind the store, taught the boy from the bakery how to tie a proper hitch knot. And he listened, always listened, as Willara filled the air with stories, some true, some not, all bright with life. One morning, she asked without pretense, "Why are you still here?" He looked at her, leaning against the store wall with her sleeves rolled up and hair tied back in a red scarf. "Because every time you talk, I remember how quiet my house is." She went still. He stepped closer. "They say you are too loud to marry." She half laughed, half scoffed. "They say a lot of things." "Well," he said, "you sound just right for my empty house." Her breath caught. "I do not know what to do with that," she whispered. He reached up, brushed a speck of dirt from her cheek. "You do not have to know yet. Just let me stay long enough for you to find out." 2 days later, the child came. A little girl, maybe 4, wrapped in a dirty blanket and carried in the arms of a boy no older than 6. They stood at the door of the feed store just after dawn, wide-eyed and silent. "Help," the boy said. Mama left us. She said someone here might. Willara dropped her ledger and ran forward. Inside, she cleaned them up, fed them bread and milk, and held the girl while she cried herself to sleep. "What is your name, sweetheart?" she asked the boy. "Alden," he said. "This is my sister, Ada." Daryn stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You know what this means." Willara nodded. "They are not going to any orphan train. They are yours now," he said. "Ours?" she blinked. He stepped closer. "I do not want to ride back to Powder River alone. I want you, your laugh, your voice, your stories. Them too, if they will have me." She stared at him, heart pounding. "You sure about that?" she said, voice shaking. He smiled. "I have never been surer of anything in my life." Willara dropped her forehead against his chest, laughter bubbling through her tears. "You picked the wrong woman if you wanted peace and quiet." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her and the sleeping girl both. "I did not come for peace. I came for you." And outside, the sun rose over Giltwater, turning the dust to fire. The wind had turned colder by late May, carrying a bite that clung to bone before the sun climbed high enough to warm the wooden slats of the feed store's walls. Willara stood at the back of the building, kneeling by a trough she had scrubbed clean before filling it from the rain barrel. Ada sat in a patch of morning light nearby, pressing her fingers into the dirt like she could draw pictures from the earth itself. She hadn't spoken since the day she arrived. Not a single word. Alden helped Daryn stack sacks of flour onto the wagon bed. The boy didn't ask questions when given tasks. He moved with a quiet precision that belonged to someone older than he was, and Daryn didn't rush him. He handed down one sack at a time, letting the boy find his rhythm. "I seen men lose fingers trying to lift too fast," Daryn said, adjusting the canvas tarp. Alden blinked up at him. "I don't mind slow." "Neither do I." Willara watched them from behind the trough, arms crossed over her apron. She tilted her face to the sun, letting the warmth smooth the tension behind her eyes. She hadn't slept much. Ada woke 3 times last night, whimpering but never crying out. Willara had taken to sleeping on a cot beside the children, a rifle within reach, not because she feared anyone in town, but because habit formed quickly when you had something worth protecting. Later, inside the store, her uncle shoved an account book toward her, his mouth set in a grim line. "You're behind 3 weeks on the Towliver order," he said, voice low so the children wouldn't hear. Willara flipped through the pages. "They changed the shipping route. I wrote to ask if they'd accept part now, part next month." "You're not running a charity." "No, but I'm not running them into ruin either. They've got 7 mouths to feed and 1 mule." He scratched at the edge of the counter. "You planning to stay here long?" She looked up. "Why?" "I've had an offer. A man from Helena wants the property. Says he'll pay in coin." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted to the window, where Daryn was showing Alden how to check a bridle strap for wear. "I thought I was helping you," she said. "You were. You are. But you've got your own life now, Willa. Maybe it's time you built on it." She closed the book slowly. "I'll talk to Daryn." That night, Willara sat on the back step of the store, Ada curled against her lap, thumb tucked in her mouth. Daryn lowered himself beside them, his legs stretching long across the porch planks. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "You look like you're thinking too loud," he said. "I always do," she murmured. He waited. She sipped. "My uncle's selling the store." Daryn didn't blink. "You want it?" "I don't know. I used to think so. But now, I think I want something steadier." He nodded once. "There's room on my land. Stream runs through it. Soil's good. Cabin needs repair, but it's strong. We could build something stable. For them. For us." She didn't speak for a long time. The wind moved through the wheatgrass like a whisper. "I've never lived where I was wanted," she said. "You'd be wanted every morning you opened your eyes." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw no hesitation in his face. Just a quiet certainty she wasn't used to being offered. "I'm not soft," she said. "I've never wanted soft." Ada stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Willara tucked the girl's ragged blanket higher and exhaled. "I'd need to say goodbye to this place." He nodded. "We'll give it a proper leaving." The next morning, Willara folded her apron and left it on the counter. She packed what she could in 2 canvas sacks and a wooden chest. Daryn hitched the wagon. Alden sat beside him, holding the reins with both hands. Ada clung to her doll, the one Willara had sewn from spare fabric and buttons. The townsfolk watched as the wagon rolled past the mill, the schoolhouse, and the shuttered saloon. Mrs. Cornwell stood at her gate, arms folded. Willara met her eyes and lifted her chin. "Not too loud to leave," she said. Mrs. Cornwell didn't answer, but her mouth twitched, just a little. They rode east, the sun warm on their backs, the road long and dusted in gold. Willara sat beside Daryn, her hand resting near his on the seat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Daryn looked over once. "You ready?" "I've never been readier." And the prairie opened wide in front of them, full of room to grow. The cabin stood just above the bend of the Powder River, its roof sagging on the west end, 2 shutters hanging loose, and a woodpile scattered from the winter's last storm. Daryn pulled the wagon to a stop beside the fence that leaned more in surrender than defiance. Willara climbed down without waiting, her boots sinking into the damp spring grass. Ada stayed tucked on her hip, thumb between her teeth, while Alden followed quietly, eyes scanning the porch with a kind of hush that came from watching too much fall apart too early. "This porch'll fall through if we leave it much longer," Willara said, shifting Ada to her other side. "That corner's rotted clean through." Daryn tossed the reins to the side. "I figured we'd start with the roof, but I'll pull boards today. Porch tomorrow." "You got nails?" "Barrel in the barn. Might need boiling to loosen the rust." She nodded once and stepped up, foot testing each board before she carried Ada through the door and into air that smelled of dust and the long sleep of unlived-in rooms. Inside, the hearth was cold, but the stones were solid. A row of shelves sagged under the weight of empty jars and a few mouse-nibbled sacks of flour. A tin cup sat alone on the far windowsill. Willara set Ada down and peeled back the curtain. The view looked out over a field gone wild with thistle and early dandelion. "We'll need a second bed," she said, already rolling up her sleeves. Daryn stepped over the threshold with Alden beside him. "There's one in the loft. Needs legs reset. I'll take a look after I scrub the boards. Ada, you want to help me chase the spiders?" The girl blinked, then gave the barest nod. Alden wandered toward the back door, where a crooked hook held an empty pail. "You want to draw water?" Daryn asked. "I can carry it. I'll walk with you." They left the door swinging behind them. Willara found a broom behind the stove and handed Ada a folded linen. Together, they worked barefoot, sweeping out nests and wiping the grime from windows. The girl didn't speak, but when Willara hummed a tune under her breath, an old ballad her mother used to sing, while darning socks, Ada sat up straighter. Her cloth moved in broader circles, and when Willara glanced over, the girl's lips were moving silently, like she knew the tune but had forgotten the sound. By sundown, the hearth was swept, the porch boards pulled, and the loft beds set upright. They ate salt pork and potatoes by lantern light, seated on crates and the edge of a trunk. Daryn carved strips of bark from a branch for Ada to play with while Alden studied the old map nailed above the stove, tracing the river's curve with his finger. Later, when the air turned sharp, Daryn and Willara stood behind the barn. She pulled her shawl tight, her eyes on the stars overhead. "You ever think it'd look like this?" he asked. She shook her head. "I didn't think it'd look like anything. I figured I'd be following someone else's life to the grave." He leaned against the fence post. "You're building your own now. I don't know what I'm doing. You're not supposed to. That's what the days are for." She turned to him, arms folded against her chest. "You sure? About all this?" Daryn took a step closer, his voice low. "I was sure the moment you looked at me like I wasn't something broken. I didn't fix you. You didn't need to." Ada's soft cry echoed from the cabin. Willara turned toward the sound, but Daryn reached for her hand. "I'll go," he said. She paused, her fingers brushing his, then let him go. Back inside, she watched from the doorway as he lifted Ada into his arms. The child curled against his shoulder, her cheek resting on the rough linen of his shirt, and her hand clutched his collar like she'd done it 100 times before. Willara stepped inside, closed the door, and felt the hush settle over the walls. Not a silence born of emptiness, a stillness that held breath and warmth and the beginning of something whole. The wheatgrass had grown tall enough to hide a rabbit, bending in waves when the wind moved through the hollow beneath the cabin. Willara stood barefoot in the tilled edge of the field, her skirt hitched in one hand, the other resting on her hip as she eyed the rows she and Alden had spent the morning carving with a borrowed plow blade and a mule with more ornery in him than strength. Her shoulders ached in new ways, but her chest felt steadier than it had in years. "You think the soil hold?" she asked, not turning as Daryn approached with a canteen. He passed it to her. "It held my mother's garden 20 summers. We'll get squash, maybe beans if the frost stays off." Willara drank, sweat drying against her temples. "I've never planted anything I expected to grow." Daryn crouched to run his fingers through the dirt. "You're growing now." She let the words sit between them without answering, then knelt to smooth the edge of a furrow Alden's hands had left uneven. The boy stood near the porch, rubbing the dust from his knees, his eyes following a bird overhead. Ada sat on the bottom step with a half-knitted scarf drooping from her lap, the needles too big for her fingers, but she kept trying. Inside, the sourdough starter Willara had coaxed from flour and river water sat bubbling in a crock beside the stove. She had begun baking bread in the mornings, one loaf for them, sometimes a second to trade with a neighboring homestead half a mile east. The woman there, Mrs. Redley, had 3 daughters and a husband with a missing leg. She paid in eggs and stories. She asked if we'd be attending the gathering next week, Willara said as they walked back toward the house, shoes in hand. "Said there'll be music." Daryn took the steps 2 at a time. "You want to go?" "I do." She glanced down at her hands. "But I'd need a dress that doesn't smell like lye soap and yeast. I've got shirts that look worse." She looked up at him. "You'd dance. If you'd teach me." That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Alden curled with a book Daryn had read aloud from before the fire. Ada tucked against Willara's side, they stood in the kitchen with bare feet on cool planks. "You lead," she said, placing his hand on her waist. "I thought the man was supposed to. Not when he's got 2 left boots." He chuckled, and she guided his step across the boards, humming a slow reel under her breath. He stumbled once, nearly knocking into the table, and she laughed, but her hands stayed steady. "Tell me something I don't know about you," he said, concentrating on his feet. She tilted her head. "I used to climb the roof of our house back in Giltwater. Sit there when the moon was full. I could see the whole town. Felt like I was bigger than it." "You were," he said. She went quiet, and he took the lead without realizing, their steps aligning. "Your turn," she said. He hesitated, then said, "I thought I'd get married by 20. My mother wanted that. But after my brother died, I stopped thinking about those kinds of things." She looked at him, her voice softer than it had ever been. What changed? You. Your laugh. Your way of filling a room without asking permission. She didn't look away. They called me too much. They didn't hear you right. The wind pressed against the shutters. Somewhere outside, the mule kicked at his post. Willara leaned into him, her brow resting just beneath his chin. I think I was waiting for someone who didn't flinch when I opened my mouth. I think I was waiting for someone who wouldn't leave when I let them see what's broken. She stayed there, close enough to feel his breath at her temple. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I believe you. They stood in the hush of the kitchen, weight shifting in time with each other, the hum of her voice low and steady. The rhythm was imperfect, but it held, just like them. A week before the summer gathering, thunderheads piled over the foothills, casting long shadows over the valley. Willara pulled the wash from the line early, bracing against the gusts that rolled in off the river. The wind tangled her hair loose from its braid, and she didn't bother taming it again. Inside, Daryn was sanding the last of the porch railings, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sawdust clinging to the curve of his forearms. Ada sat nearby, tying dried yarrow to a length of string. She'd taken to collecting herbs and flowers, arranging them with the kind of care a child usually reserved for dolls. Willara had shown her how to bundle them for drying, and now the rafters above the hearth held small rows of lavender, mint, and wild chamomile. Alden had gone to help Mrs. Redley's oldest carry feedback from a neighbor's barn. He'd asked to go himself, and Daryn had said yes without pause. Willara leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the steady rhythm of Daryn's hand over the wood. You were right about the grain, she said. It's sweet once you get past the first layer. He didn't look up. Same could be said for people. She stepped forward, brushing a curl from her cheek. You planning to finish the roof before winter? If the rains hold off. I could ask Mrs. Redley for her husband's thatching rake. She offered it last week. Daryn set the sanding block down and met her gaze. You thinking of asking many more favors? Willara narrowed her eyes. You saying I ask too many already? I'm saying you're getting good at letting people help you. She didn't answer right away. She lifted one of the railing spindles, ran her palm over it, then set it back into place. I used to think needing someone meant weakness, she said. Now it just feels like breathing. Daryn stood, dusting his hands off. You breathe different when you're here. She moved closer. How's that? Like you're not waiting to be told you're too much. Her eyes settled on the corner post he'd finished shaping. You've been fixing this place piece by piece. You ever want something new instead? I don't need new. I just need something that stays. He was standing close enough now that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the one curved like a crescent. I stay, she said. I know. That night, after the wind passed and the lanterns were lit, Willara took down the blue linen she'd been saving since Giltwater. She stitched late into the night, candlelight flickering over her needlework as Daryn carved a new latch for the pantry door. When he paused to stretch, she reached for his hand. I'm making something for the gathering, she said. He traced the callus on her thumb. A dress. Yes. Color. She smiled. You'll see. By the time the day came, the sky had cleared, and the river ran high from the mountain melt. They rode the wagon into the open clearing where families gathered near a raised platform of rough-hewn boards. Fiddles played, children chased chickens through the tall grass, and the scent of baked apples hung thick in the air. Willara wore the dress she'd sewn blue linen with white stitching along the hem. She'd let her hair down, curling soft over her shoulders, and tied back with a strip of lace. Ada clung to her hand, wearing a new apron sewn from flour sack fabric, and Alden walked just behind them, face unreadable but eyes alert. Daryn stepped beside her, his shirt pressed, boots polished. "You look like you belong here," he said quietly. "I do." They danced once, then twice, until the fiddler laughed and called out that Daryn had finally found his feet. Willara laughed too, but not too loud this time, just enough to draw him closer, his hand settling at her waist like it had always belonged there. Mrs. Redley brought over a plate of blackberry pie and told Willara she was glad to see her dancing. "I never thought I'd see you still," she said, handing her a fork. "You always looked like a woman chasing something." Willara took a bite and smiled. "I was." By dusk, Ada had fallen asleep in Willara's lap, her cheek pressed to her skirts. Alden sat beside Daryn, watching the fireflies gather near the edge of the woods. Willara leaned her head on Daryn's shoulder. "You ever think you'd have this?" she asked. "No," he said. "But I knew what it felt like to miss it, even before I'd seen it." She laced her fingers through his. "We're not missing anything now." They stayed until the stars rose clear above the trees, then rode home slow, the children bundled under blankets in the back. The cabin windows glowed warm as they neared, and the porch stood finished and waiting. Inside, Willara tucked Ada into bed, kissed Alden's forehead, then stepped outside where Daryn stood beneath the eaves, watching the moon rise. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek between his shoulders. He covered her hands with his. "I never thanked you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me before I knew how to be seen." He turned, pulling her into his arms. "I didn't need to understand you to know I wanted you." "I'm not running anymore," she said. "I know. We're home now." They kissed beneath the wide Montana sky, nothing hurried or uncertain in it, just the quiet promise of morning, of days spent planting and mending and raising what they'd chosen together. They married before the first frost, under the cottonwood behind the barn, with Mrs. Redley's daughters tossing wildflowers and Alden standing tall beside Daryn. Ada held Willara's hand through the whole thing, her thumb no longer in her mouth, but her fingers still curled tight around the woman who had become her mother in every way that mattered. The roof held strong through winter, the garden bloomed again in spring, and every night, when the wind settled, Daryn would rest his hand on Willara's hip beneath the quilt she'd stitched by firelight, and she'd breathe steady beside him, no longer waiting to be told she belonged. She already knew.